You know, when people start introducing you as having been around for 25 years, you have to start your speech by saying something about rumours of my death have been greatly exaggerated, or rumours of my embalmment have been greatly exaggerated. I would urge you to buy the book, and I do that for one reason only, and that is that all the proceeds go to the Aboriginal Literacy Foundation, so you're not putting money in my pocket, you're supporting them and their valuable work. So I'll just get that out of the way. I knew Canberra was cold, I had no idea just how cold it was, but still, we'll see how I go. So when the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody produced its final report, it concluded that the high rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody stemmed from the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in police and police jails and police lockups, thanks to David Biles, who actually established that. The Commission made more than 300 recommendations, all bar one of which were accepted by the Keating government, and it assigned today's equivalent of $672 million to put them into effect. As nearly all of you know, instead of going down, the rate of Aboriginal imprisonment went up. And this is obviously not the outcome that we were expecting when Prime Minister Paul Keating proclaimed in federal parliament that there's no more central issue to our national identity and self-esteem than the injustices brought home to us all by the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. So today what I want to talk about is how it came to this. Why did the Royal Commission and the Keating government response to it fail so dismally to reduce the rate of Aboriginal imprisonment? Well, to get an answer to this question, we need to go back to the 1970s, before some of you were even born. But I won't dwell too long in that part of the world. So the 2 decades prior to the establishment of the Royal Commission were a period of growing academic interest in the treatment of Indigenous Australians by police and courts. Just to give some examples, in her seminal work Without Fear or Favour, published in 1977, Elizabeth Eggleston claimed to have evidence that South Australian police charged Aboriginal people with offences which, if they'd been committed by non-Aboriginal people, would have attracted a warning or caution, or perhaps nothing at all. She pointed out that Aboriginal defendants in South Australia were far less likely to obtain legal representation than non-Aboriginal defendants, and that their cases were often adjudicated by justices of the peace with no formal training in the law. In 1983, another seminal work, Ronalds, Chapman and Kitchener, drew attention to the very high rates of conviction for public order offences in New South Wales towns with large Aboriginal populations. Aboriginal people, they said, were being continually and repeatedly arrested for trivial offences that wouldn't warrant police attention if committed by non-Aboriginal people. Again, in 1990, Gale, Bailey, Harris and Wondersitz published a study showing that Aboriginal juveniles accounted for just 1.2% of the South Australian population, but 7.8% of all young people apprehended, 13.9% of all referrals to court, and 28.1% of all detention orders. The high level of Aboriginal overrepresentation in prison, they said, was due to the compounding effect of racial discrimination suffered at earlier steps in the criminal justice processes. With few and isolated exceptions, such as Rod Broadhurst and John Walker, little or no consideration was given by scholars at the time to the possibility that Indigenous imprisonment might have something to do with Indigenous offending. By the end of the 1980s, most people sympathetic to the plight of Aboriginal Australians had come to the view that their overrepresentation in prison was nothing more or less than a reflection of racial bias in the operation of the criminal justice system. And by the time the Royal Commission finished its inquiry, it had been strongly influenced by this argument. It criticised the criminal law because a large percentage of Indigenous detentions in custody resulted from arrests from minor offences such as drunkenness, offensive language and fine default. It criticised the police for failing to employ alternatives to custody and argued that the over-reliance on arrest led to longer criminal records and therefore a higher risk of bail refusal and imprisonment. It criticised state and territory bail laws because they said Indigenous defendants were said to lack the financial and social resources required to obtain bail. It criticised the community-based alternatives to custody in rural areas, arguing that it forced courts to rely more heavily on custodial sanctions when dealing with Indigenous offenders. Finally, it criticised the funding or the level of funding for Aboriginal legal aid services on the grounds that lack of funding left many Indigenous defendants without legal representation. Well, despite its concern about institutional racism, the Commission did stop short of blaming the high rate of Indigenous imprisonment on that factor alone. As the Commission itself put it, Changes to the operation of the criminal justice system alone will not have a significant impact on the number of Aboriginal people in custody or the number who die in custody. The social and economic circumstances which give rise to Aboriginal people offending or which predispose Aboriginal people to offender, which explain why the criminal justice system focuses on them, are much more significant factors in their overrepresentation. Well, the Commission listed numerous examples of disadvantage which in its view contributed to Indigenous imprisonment. They included unemployment and poverty, poor health, drug and alcohol abuse, poor school performance, youth boredom, welfare dependence, lack of access to land, family dissolution, loss of respect for Indigenous authority, overcrowded housing, destruction of Indigenous social norms and many, many other things. In fact, there was barely a form of Indigenous disadvantage that the Royal Commission didn't implicitly or explicitly identify as a potential cause of Indigenous overrepresentation in prison. Curiously, it made no attempt to list these problems in any order of priority, a decision which, of course, would have been a nightmare for any public servant charged with responsibility for developing a reform agenda. But the reason it didn't list them in any order of priority is that it took the view that Indigenous economic and social disadvantage was really just a symptom of a much deeper problem. The much deeper problem, according to the Commission, was Indigenous disempowerment. In the words of the Commission, Aboriginal people have for 200 years been dominated to an extraordinary degree by non-Aboriginal society. Reducing that disadvantage requires an end of domination and an empowerment of Aboriginal people. Control of their lives and of their communities must be returned to Aboriginal hands. So the Commission set out, in a sense, to reverse the process of colonisation and dispossession, at least so far as disempowerment was concerned. Aboriginal people would be given back power over their lives and land, and this would restore them to physical, economic and social health. The plan, I think, was heroic to say the least. As the noted anthropologist Peter Sutton has observed, the Commission seems to have proceeded on the basis that the old pre-colonial systems of social discipline and control would miraculously revive the moment they were given a chance, despite having been, as he called it, thoroughly smashed and displaced from one end of the country to the other. Okay, so what was the response of federal, state and territory governments to the Royal Commission? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Keating government accepted the Commission's arguments lock, stock and barrel. To deal with the causes of Indigenous offending, Keating asked ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, to come up with a strategy to empower Indigenous Australians. And the policy proposals that the Keating government put forward, or the policy proposals that ATSIC put forward, form much of the basis for the Commonwealth's response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. The plan involved large-scale spending on land acquisition and business development. $60 million was set aside for land acquisition and land development. $44 million was set aside for a community development employment program, better known these days as the CDEP scheme. $23 million was set aside for a community economic initiate scheme. This is in 1991 dollars, by the way. And another $23 million was set aside for a young people's development program. Significant sums were also invested in a number of smaller initiatives such as Aboriginal education workers, Aboriginal industry strategies and Aboriginal sport and recreation programs. The Commonwealth, though, didn't have to go it alone. I'll tell you why in a minute. Keating insisted that the states and territories purge their criminal justice systems of what he described, quote, as entrenched institutional racism. Now, faced with a demand like this on law and order, you'd normally expect the states and territories to tell the Commonwealth to get lost. Anybody here from states and territories? Confirm that? But they didn't. In a rare display of federal-state unanimity, which Keating described at the time as a truly national achievement, state and territory governments agreed to make substantial changes to their criminal justice systems to reduce the rate of Aboriginal imprisonment. All states and territories except Victoria, Queensland and Tasmania decriminalised public drunkenness. All introduced an arrangement whereby Aboriginal legal services were advised when an Aboriginal person was taken into custody. Several introduced legislation expunging criminal records after a set period of time. Most expanded the range of alternatives to imprisonment. Most also passed legislation which established prison as a sanction of last resort. And what was the result of all this? Well, when the Commission handed down its report, the Indigenous imprisonment rate stood at 1,438 per 100,000 Indigenous people. By 2013, it declined to 2,335 per 100,000 people, an increase of 62%. as you can see from this next figure, which shows the percentage change in imprisonment rates each year after the Royal Commission compared with the imprisonment rate at the time of the Royal Commission. Okay, so each state's original position is taken as the starting point. And you're looking at the percentage changes. And as you can see, every state and territory eventually experienced a substantial increase. The worst of them was Western Australia, although it didn't end up much worse than some states, such as, my colour blindness is going to defeat me, help me here, looks like the Northern Territory, but I'd be guessing. Help a blind man out. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous imprisonment rates also widened. At the time of the Royal Commission, Indigenous Australians were about 14 times more likely than non-Indigenous Australians to end up in prison. By the end of 2013, they were 18 times more likely to end up in prison. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous imprisonment is now 6 times larger than the gap between African American and white imprisonment rates in the United States. The nearest, this is, as far as I can see, a spectacular policy failure. In fact, I can't think of any policy failure quite so dramatic, except perhaps Bob Hawke's promise in 1987 that by 1990 no Australian child would be living in poverty. So why did the collective efforts of federal, state and territory governments fail so dismally to reduce the rate of Aboriginal imprisonment? Well, when policies fail, it's always a good idea to have a look at the assumptions on which they're based. So let's begin with the assumption of racial bias. Only someone blind to history would deny that Indigenous Australians have been the subject of discriminatory and oppressive treatment by police and the criminal justice system. The process began in the earliest days of the colony and has continued ever since. In April 1816, for example, following attacks by Aboriginal people on settlers stealing their land, Governor Macquarie sent out 3 detachments of soldiers to track down, capture or kill all Aborigines without distinction between what he called friendly and hostile. Similar violence, I've explained in the book, occurred in Victoria and South Australia. Queensland, in what I think is perhaps one of the most egregious examples of institutional racism, in the early 20th century established a penal settlement on Palm Island and filled it with what one historian described as children, alleged troublemakers, unmarried mothers of half-caste children, aged and sick, petty offenders and hardened criminals from all over the state. It's true that some of them were sent there following sentencing, but some of them were sent there immediately following release from court. Some were simply transported to Palm Island in periodic roundups by police. Now, mercifully, those days are over, but the policing of Aboriginal communities is still sometimes very heavy-handed. If you want evidence of this, you only have to look at the full-scale riots that have occurred in Brewarrina in 1987, in Walgett and Burke in 1997, on Palm Island in 2004, and again in Redfern in 2004. This is one of those cases, though, where the premises of the argument are true, but the conclusion said to follow from them is not. It's true that Indigenous Australians have experienced grave and protracted injustice, but it's not true that injustice is the primary reason for Aboriginal overrepresentation in prison. There's another part to this story of imprisonment which is much less often told. To see this part, you only need to look at the offences for which Indigenous Australians are being imprisoned. Less than 1% are serving time for a public order offence. More than 60% are in prison for violent offences. The violence isn't directed at police or non-Aboriginal people. It's directed in the main, overwhelming in fact, at other Aboriginal people. The hospitalisation rate for Indigenous males for assault in Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia and the Northern Territory is 27 times higher than the corresponding hospitalisation rate for non-Indigenous Australians. The hospitalisation rate for assaults involving Indigenous women is 38 times the assault-related hospitalisation rate in those states for non-Indigenous females. This is a disaster, I think we'd all agree. It's true, of course, that intracommunal violence is not the only reason Indigenous Australians end up in prison. The other offences that land them there are far from trivial. As you can see, about 19% of Indigenous prisoners are serving time for theft offences, mostly break and enter, and mostly repeat offenders. Another 11% are in prison for breaching court orders, many of which were imposed as alternatives to prison for earlier serious offences such as assault, sexual assault, robbery or burglary. But that's not the real argument, I think, against the racist theory of Indigenous overrepresentation in prison. Thanks to work that's been done by David Bales and his group, we now have the NATSIS survey and a number of data sources that allow us to investigate this issue much more thoroughly. And several rigorous studies have been conducted into racial bias in bail and sentencing in Australia. All of them show that once you control for factors that courts are allowed or required to take into account, such as offence type, there is little, if any, evidence of racial bias. The unpalatable truth is that Indigenous Australians are overrepresented in prison, not because the criminal justice system is biased against them, though it certainly has been in the past, but because they're overrepresented among violent and persistent offenders. The question that needs to be answered is why this is so, which brings me to the Commission's assumptions about disempowerment and disadvantage. The Commission's argument boiled down in essence to the claim that Indigenous Australians had become disempowered, that this disempowerment had resulted in economic and social disadvantage, and that the disadvantage in turn had resulted in high rates of imprisonment. There are 5 problems with this line of argument or this theory. The first is that all Indigenous Australians share a common legacy of colonisation, dispossession and disempowerment. The overwhelming majority, though, also suffer from serious economic and social disadvantage. The vast majority, though, have never been arrested, let alone imprisoned for a criminal offence. The second problem is that it's hard to reconcile the hypothesis that empowerment prevents crime with the existence of crimes by the powerful, such as insider trading, price fixing, corporate fraud, political corruption and money laundering. As recent events in my happy little state, New South Wales, have shown, empowerment doesn't prevent crime. All it does is enlarge the scope of criminal opportunities for those who are motivated to offend. The third problem is that the Commission actually had no grounds for its assumption that Indigenous disadvantage is a product of Indigenous disempowerment. It never explained how disempowerment caused problems like poverty, unemployment, poor school performance, alcohol abuse, child neglect, poor housing, poor health or crime. In fact, on the evidence available to the Commission at the time, it would have been just as reasonable to argue that disadvantage causes disempowerment as it was to argue the reverse. The fourth problem is that even if we were to accept the proposition that Indigenous imprisonment is due to Indigenous disadvantage, it doesn't really tell us very much. Which forms of disadvantage, one might ask, matter the most? Is poor housing and sanitation just as big a cause of crime as drug and alcohol abuse? Is the high rate of burglary among Indigenous kids due to lack of recreational facilities, crowded housing, poor health or drug abuse? Without answers to these questions, it's impossible to devise effective prevention policies. The fifth problem, though, and I think from my point of view certainly the biggest, is that the Commission's analysis of the relationship between disadvantage and crime was deeply flawed. The focus on alcohol abuse was sensible enough. Alcohol abuse is one of the strongest correlates of Indigenous arrest and imprisonment, particularly where violent offences are concerned. And it's true that Aboriginal Australians who drink, and there are a larger proportion who don't drink at all than the non-Aboriginal Australians, but those who do drink tend to drink far more than their non-Indigenous counterparts. If you want evidence of this, just look at the death ratios from alcohol-induced poisoning. They range between 5.4, that is to say the alcohol-induced death rate for Aboriginal people compared with non-Aboriginal people, ranges between 5.4 in Queensland and 11.1 in Western Australia. The effort to reduce Indigenous offending through spending on job creation schemes and business enterprises, though, was entirely misconceived. Most serious and persistent offending has its roots in early childhood, well before entry into the labour market. The prototypical scenario involves a mother or father or caregiver whose parenting skills have been compromised by drug or alcohol abuse, poor health, domestic violence, or a major psychiatric illness such as depression. This prevents the establishment of a strong bond between parent and child. Lack of a strong bond then leads on to child neglect and abuse, followed by poor school performance, school failure, association with delinquent peers, substance abuse, unemployment, eventually crime and imprisonment. When the kids affected by this process grow up, they have kids of their own and the process starts all over again. You can't stop this vicious circle by spending money on Indigenous job creation schemes or subsidies for Indigenous business, although there's no inherent harm in those things. As Heckman and others have pointed out, the mastery of skills for economic success is a hierarchical process in which later attainments are built on foundations laid earlier. It's difficult to succeed in the labour market if you fail to complete or do poorly at school, It's difficult to do well at school if you're ill, malnourished, abused, neglected, or simply live in a home environment that's dangerous or antithetical to study. Yet these are precisely the conditions in which so many Aboriginal young people live. The rate of substantiated child abuse and neglect among Indigenous kids is between 6 and 11 times higher than among non-Indigenous children. The domestic violence hospitalisation rate among 25 to 35-year-old Indigenous women is 49 times higher than the corresponding rate for non-Indigenous females. These are hospitalisation rates. This is not crime statistics that you might say are a consequence of police focusing on Indigenous people. Well, you'd expect this to compromise Indigenous child development, and it does. The Australian Early Development Index, AEDI, is a measure of child development taken at the point of entry into school. For those of you who don't know, it has over 100 questions covering 5 developmental domains known to be important for school readiness. These domains are communication skills and general knowledge, language and cognitive skills, emotional maturity, social competence, and physical health and well-being. The proportion of Indigenous kids at risk in each of these domains is between 2 and 3 times higher than the proportion of non-Indigenous kids. It's no wonder that Indigenous school completion rates are 27 percentage points lower than non-Indigenous school completion rates, nor is it any wonder that Indigenous school students lag far behind non-Indigenous students in the achievement of national minimum standards in reading, writing and numeracy. If you want to improve Indigenous economic outcomes and reduce Indigenous imprisonment, these are the problems that you need to fix. If you want a concrete illustration of why this is important, let me give you the example of the Pilbara mining boom. If any regional economic stimulus had the potential to enhance Indigenous employment, this was it. In 2000 alone, Hammersley Limited paid $133 million in wages and salaries to 2,050 employees. 90% of this money wasn't spent elsewhere. 90% of the money they spent was paid in the Pilbara. But the benefits to the region's Indigenous inhabitants was meagre. And the reason for this is simple. Out of the 4,749 Indigenous inhabitants in the Pilbara over the age of 15, 88% had no post-school qualification, 32% left school before the age of 10, 59%, more than half, had been hospitalised in the previous year, 21% had diabetes, 22% had been arrested in the previous year, and 7% were in custody or under correctional supervision. It's easy to see why, in the light of these figures, the Keating government's approach to reducing Indigenous disadvantage was so misguided. Well, I don't have too much time left, so let me just close by highlighting what I think are the key priorities for the future. The first thing we need is a circuit breaker, a strategy or set of strategies that produces a quick reduction in the rate of Indigenous imprisonment, because that'll convince policymakers that getting Indigenous Australians out of prison is not a lost cause. In my view, the best place to start in that regard is with better resourced and more effective offender rehabilitation programs. Most people don't realise that Indigenous Australians entering prison are, for the most part, returning to prison. Our research has shown that small reductions in the rate of return to prison can produce large reductions in the number of Indigenous Australians in custody. In New South Wales, for example, a 10% reduction in the rate of Indigenous return to custody would reduce the number of Indigenous people in prison in New South Wales within a year by 365 and save $11 million per annum in the process. The next step is better drug and alcohol treatment services in remote areas and stronger support for Indigenous communities that want to stem the flow of drugs and alcohol into their lands. If we succeed in this, we'll get an immediate reduction in Indigenous violence. Down the track, we'll also get a reduction in child abuse and neglect, and that'll further enhance the number, or further reduce the number of kids getting involved in crime and ending up in prison. The third priority is for better pre- and postnatal support services for Indigenous women to ensure that they're healthy and able to give their children the care, support and attention that they need. The fourth thing we need is a set of strategies that firstly encourages Indigenous parents to send their kids to school, and I don't have the magic solution for this, but others I know are experimenting in this area. Secondly, maintains their interest and engages them while they're at school. And thirdly, provides special support to kids who look like they're at risk of dropping out. The fifth requirement is for increased government financial support for programs like the Commonwealth Indigenous Employment Program, which gives financial assistance to employers who hire Indigenous Australians. That's something that you want to see ramped up after these other initiatives have been put into effect. The final requirement, though, is for ongoing funding for each of these initiatives. Time-limited funding for Indigenous programs is worse than useless. It alienates those who deliver the programs, and it trashes the hopes of those who are meant to benefit from them. I don't pretend for a minute that any of this is easy. I do hope, though, that if enough people share a common vision of what's required, our combined weight will be enough to persuade state, territory and federal governments to make a fresh start on reducing the number of Aboriginal people in prison. Thank you.